Hello everyone, and welcome back to Royalty Now, where we talk about a person's life and then reveal what they may have truly looked like by using only the best portraits and descriptions from their time. Today's subject is Lorenzo de Medici, otherwise known as Lorenzo il Magnifico. Born into a family with high expectations and bitter enemies, Lorenzo would be thrust into power at an early age and was forced to play the dangerous game of politics with the rich and powerful men of the Italian Renaissance. My name's Andre, and I'll be your host for today's episode. So let's go ahead and get started. Lorenzo de Medici was born on the 1st of January 1449 in the city of Florence, to his mother Lucretia and his father Piero. By the time of his birth, Lorenzo's family, the Medicis, had already become one of the wealthiest and most legendary families in Europe. Their rise was largely thanks to the exploits of his grandfather, Cosimo de Medici, whose idea to open branches in cities all across Europe would make the Medici Bank the most respected bank for Europe's social elite. The bank's profits would skyrocket over the course of the 1420s, and the Medici family's influence would rise right along with them, with even the Pope choosing to bank with the Medicis. By the mid-1430s, Cosimo would become the de facto ruler of Florence and was able to begin implementing his vision for the city. But there was something different about Cosimo. He saw himself not as a businessman or even a diplomat, but as an intellectual whose main purpose in life was to promote beauty, truth, and wisdom and make Florence the most glorious city in the world. To prove that he meant it, he would personally fund the completion of the Santa Maria del Fiore, which had gone unfinished for nearly a century. Cosimo's choice for the project would be a man named Filippo Brunelleschi, who at the age of 40 had zero architectural training. What he did have was an ingenious plan. Although met with skepticism and ridicule, Filippo Brunelleschi would go on to design and build the world's largest dome with groundbreaking techniques that were way ahead of their time and that experts to this day still don't fully understand. The dome is still standing nearly 600 years later and is a testament to Cosimo's ability to recognize greatness in otherwise ordinary-seeming people. As Lorenzo de Medici grew into his teens, his grandfather Cosimo would recognize the potential in him and his younger brother Giuliano to lead the family into the next generation. Both Lorenzo and Giuliano would be sent to be tutored by various great teachers, including not only brilliant businessmen and diplomats, but also philosophers. The brothers were taught that the key to a better society was the celebration of human potential and achievement and the importance of intellect, morality, and the arts. As they both matured into more serious young men, the brothers were sent all over Italy to meet important political figures and religious figures, such as the Pope in Rome. But even though Lorenzo was older, Piero always made sure that the boys were treated as equals, so that they wouldn't begin to fight for the power that would one day be theirs. This was necessary also because, although Lorenzo was very popular with the people, his brother Giuliano was known as the Golden Boy. Handsome, funny, and popular with the ladies of Florence, Giuliano was often used as a model by a painter that the two grew up with named Sandro Botticelli. It's even been rumored that Giuliano may have had an affair with the most beautiful woman in Italy, Simonetta Vespucci, who was Botticelli's muse and the model for many of Botticelli's most famous paintings. Lorenzo, on the other hand, was not so lucky. He was described as rather plain. He had a broad frame with short legs, a large squash nose with short-sighted eyes, and a harsh voice. Even one of his best friends is quoted as saying that nature had been a stepmother to him in regards to his personal appearance. But it's the rest of the quote that I think matters more. Nature was a loving mother in all things concocted with the mind. His complexion was dark, and although his face was not handsome, it was so full of dignity that it compelled respect. He was also said to have a certain charisma, a cheerful nature, an easy smile, and a lively personality. Jealousy never seemed to take hold of Lorenzo, even with all the attention his younger brother got. Plus, his appearance didn't seem to discourage him with women too badly, with Italian historians saying he was licentious and very amorous. In 1464, the great patriarch of the Medici family, Cosimo, died. Lorenzo's father, Piero, took over the Medici Bank and immediately began calling in all the long-standing loans that Cosimo had been deliberately, and more correctly, politically, ignoring. This sudden move bankrupted a large number of merchants and began to erode support for the Medicis and their power in Florence. For the first time, the Medici's bitter rivals began to have the manpower and support to sabotage them. In 1466 and 1467, attempts were made on Piero's life, which failed only because Lorenzo discovered the plot and warned his father. But by the end of the 1460s, it was Piero's own health that was working against him. For most of his life, Piero had struggled with recurring bouts of gout, leading to his unkind nickname, Piero the Gouty. By 1469, Piero knew that he didn't have long. He would name both of his children as his successor as the Lord of Florence and the head of the Medici Bank. On December 2nd, 1469, Piero died. Lorenzo and Giuliano were now some of the most powerful people in Europe at the age of 20 and 16 years old. Although the brothers had been prepared for this moment for pretty much their whole lives, becoming the lords of Florence and the heads of one of the biggest banks in Europe at such a young age must have been terrifying, especially knowing that their enemies would surely use this moment to strike. To make matters worse, Lorenzo came to realize that his grandfather Cosimo's spending had left the Medici Bank in a much worse position than he had been told, with all of his building projects and extracurricular spending drying up its finances. If Lorenzo's enemies knew just how vulnerable he truly was, he would surely be dead within months. Those first few nights as the Lord of Florence, Lorenzo must have had a hard time sleeping. Although Lorenzo didn't have anything to help him wake up refreshed, he finally did come up with an idea to help him through this uncertain time. Even if the Medicis were vulnerable, they were still a powerful family. And as head of the Medici Bank, he was the most eligible bachelor in Italy. His first move would be to marry himself into one of the most noble families in all of Italy, the Orsinis, who were said to trace back their lineage all the way to Julius Caesar. The alliance of these two families elevated the Medici to another level in Italian society, and was enough to make people think twice about plotting against him. But this didn't solve all of Lorenzo's problems. Any ill will the people of Florence were beginning to feel towards the Medicis had to be righted immediately. Luckily for Lorenzo, he knew just the way to win back their hearts. If his grandfather had taught him anything, it was that Florentines didn't care how much money you had. They cared how you spent it. Ignoring his own wealth, Lorenzo began to spend as lavishly as ever, even more than his grandfather. He funded building projects, built free libraries who were accessible to all, paid for churches, weddings, festivals, carnivals, and balls. And thanks to Lorenzo's eye for talent and deep pockets, Florence was home to some of the most talented artists in the world, with names like Sandro Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, and Michelangelo, all able to focus on their craft thanks to the patronage of Lorenzo de Medici. In only a couple of years, Florence had become the cultural center of Europe, and the people had forgotten any issue they ever had with Medici rule, with even some rival families calling Lorenzo and Giuliano's rule benevolent tyranny. Feeling more powerful than ever, it seemed as though the Medicis were untouchable. They were wrong. In 1471, a new pope was elected, Sisto IV. Although best known to history for his construction of the Sistine Chapel, to many of his contemporaries, he was known as a villainous, worldly man who used his position as pope for his own gain and his own desires. Within months of his election, he had surrounded himself with attractive, young clergymen and handed his family members some of the most powerful positions in Italy, making them obscenely rich, eventually pawning them off with marriage alliances to some of the most powerful families in Europe. In 1474, Pope Sisto decided that he wanted to buy his illegitimate son, Girolamo Riario, a small town called Imola. But his intentions behind the purchase weren't just out of the kindness of his heart. He wanted to use the area to take over the trade between Florence and Venice and expand the Papal States. What he didn't know was that Lorenzo de Medici had already beaten him to the punch and had already put in an offer for the town that had been accepted by its owners, the Sforza family. When Pope Sisto heard of Lorenzo's offer, he sweetened the pot, offering much more money than Lorenzo and a promise to favor the Sforza family in any future endeavors or conflicts they may have. The Sforzas couldn't help but accept the Pope's terms, and Lorenzo's claim to the land was swept away in a matter of weeks after years of negotiations. But the Pope seemed to forget one very important detail. who he was banking with. When the Medici Bank was asked to back the Pope's substantial deal, Lorenzo let his ego get in his way and personally refused him. Pope Sisto IV was absolutely furious, and he wasn't exactly known to be a forgiving man. He would immediately end the Vatican's partnership with the Medici Bank and take God's business elsewhere. Unsurprisingly, he decided to take his immense amount of money and influence to the Pazzi Bank, the Medici's bitter rivals. The Pazzi family had long been overshadowed by the Medicis and were incredibly jealous of the power that they were losing out on, with Lorenzo and Giuliano being allowed to rule unchecked. But with the Pope now doing business with them, they finally had the money and power behind them to ruin the Medici family. In early 1478, Francesco de Pazzi met with a man named Girolamo Rario, who was Pope Sisto's close nephew and protege. The two of them would instigate an idea that would end up becoming the Pazzi Conspiracy, and the two of them would take this plan to Pope Sisto, hoping to get his blessing. He would give them a perfectly cold and calculated answer. In terms of the Holy Office, he of course could never sanction murder, but he made it very clear that it would be of great benefit to the papacy if the Medici were removed from their position of power in Florence, and that he would deal kindly with anyone who was able to do so. And with that, the Pazzi Conspiracy was set into motion. On Easter Sunday, April 26, 1478, Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano attended High Mass at the Duomo in Florence. Easter was one of the few times each year that Giuliano and Lorenzo could be seen together in public, as it was one of the most important days of the year. As Mass ended, the two brothers walked out of the beautiful church. Distracted by conversation, Giuliano went one way, and Lorenzo went the other. As Lorenzo talked with a close friend of his, there was a sudden cry from a familiar voice. But before Lorenzo was even able to turn and look, he was attacked by men with knives. Chaos and confusion suddenly erupted as the people surrounding Lorenzo began to realize what was happening and ran for their lives. Lorenzo realized he was fighting for his life. In a matter of moments, he was able to pull out his own knife and furiously slash at any hands that reached for him. Through miraculous luck and the help of those around him, Lorenzo was able to pull away from his attackers and run back inside the church. Amazingly, Lorenzo's only injuries were small cuts on his neck and leg. He would immediately begin his escape to his villa, which luckily wasn't far. It wasn't until he reached his home and Lorenzo asked for Giuliano that he realized that the familiar voice that had alerted him outside of the church was that of his own little brother. Giuliano de Medici, unable to run because of a knee injury he had suffered, was brutally murdered, with his brother only meters away. The man who killed him was recognized by the crowd as none other than Francesco de Pazzi. Immediately after killing Giuliano, the assassins had tried to take control of the Palazzo della Signoria and told the people of Florence that this was their chance to rise up against Medici rule and reclaim Florence for themselves. Unfortunately for Pazzi's men, the crowd decided against a revolt in favor of justice for Giuliano. Outraged citizens began to hunt down members of the Pazzi family one by one and bring him to justice. Francesco de Pazzi would be taken from under his bed and dragged through the streets of Florence before hanging from the Palazzo della Signoria. But for a heartbroken and outraged Lorenzo, the full truth of the day wouldn't reveal itself to him until he learned that a man named Salvati had been arrested with the men who tried to take City Hall. Salvati was the Archbishop of Pisa, a prestigious position that was given to him because of his fierce loyalty to Pope Sisto. The wheels began to turn in Lorenzo's head, coming to a conclusion that he could hardly believe. It was the Pope who had tried to kill him. It was the Pope who had murdered his brother. Before the day was out, 30 men would be killed in connection with Giuliano's murder, including the head of the Pazzi family, Jacopo, who was hanged from the Palazzo della Signora next to the body of the Archbishop of Pisa, Salvati. Although Salvati's guilt was undeniable, his death was a severe blow to Sisto IV, who would excommunicate Lorenzo and the entire city-state of Florence. All of Medici's assets were seized, and Sisto worked furiously to see to the destruction of the Medici family's empire. He would ally himself with the Ottomans to threaten Venice, and then allied with the King of Naples to invade Florence. But even as the Pope and his allies rained down on Florence, the people remained loyal to Lorenzo. Still, Lorenzo knew how costly and frankly unwinnable the situation had become. With little to no options left for him, he would try one last-ditch effort to save Florence from being completely overrun. In late 1479, Lorenzo sent the King of Naples an offer for a temporary truce and asked to meet him face to face. King Ferdinand suspiciously accepted, and in December of 1479, Lorenzo de Medici, at great risk to himself, embarked on Neapolitan ships to meet the man that could destroy him. All of Italy held its breath, knowing that if the meeting failed, its consequences would mean all-out war, and for Lorenzo, the destruction of everything his family had ever worked for. As the days passed, rumors spread throughout Italy that Lorenzo had been taken prisoner by King Ferdinand. The days soon turned into weeks, and then months, with no news on an agreement or disagreement. But finally, on March 17, 1480, a decision was made. Against all odds, Lorenzo had used his wit and charm to convince King Ferdinand not only to end the war, but to ally himself with Florence. Pope Sisto, now alone in his battle with Lorenzo, was forced to withdraw from the fight and swallow his pride for the first time in his life. He would die 4 years later. Lorenzo would return to Florence a hero. His willingness to put himself in danger and his ability to charm a king who held his entire destiny in his hands left the people of Florence in awe of their lord. It was here that he earned the nickname Lorenzo il Magnifico. Lorenzo would spend the rest of the 1480s in peace, raising 11 children with his wife Clarice. He adopted his brother Giuliano's only son, Giulio, and would raise him as his own in honor of his late brother. But during the mid to late 1480s, Lorenzo began to have horrible attacks of pain that started in his feet and hands, but eventually reached all over his body, giving him pounding headaches. And all those doctors said that it was most likely the same disease his father had suffered from. He knew that something was different. His voice began to change, and his features began to look different than when he was a younger man. It wouldn't be until 1945 that we would learn of his true diagnosis: acromegaly. Lorenzo suffered from a rare disease which, left untreated, leads to changes in appearance, the enlargement of hands and organs, and can cause many health issues for the person affected. It was this rare disease that caused Lorenzo's appearance to change so much in his later life. By the time the 1490s came around, Florence was also changing. A man named Girolamo Savonarola would start a movement in the once free-thinking city, convincing the people that they had strayed too far from God. Medici rule began to erode once again, but Lorenzo's attacks of pain were only getting worse, distracting him from his work. By 1492, the attacks had become so severe that Lorenzo was constantly bedridden and incredibly weak. On April 8, 1492, Lorenzo de Medici died at the age of 43. The entire population of Florence would attend Lorenzo's funeral to honor the man who always seemed to put Florence first. Lorenzo's eldest son Piero would take over as the head of the Medici family, but he would fail miserably to fill his father's shoes. Within only 2 years, the Medici Bank, once the richest in the world, would permanently close, and Piero be exiled from Florence forever, ending the Medici's nearly 70-year rule. But the story of the Medici family was far from over. Medici's second eldest Giovanni and his late brother's son Giulio would both go on to become the Pope. The Medicis would go on to become kings and queens of Europe, yet it's still Lorenzo that is seen as the greatest amongst them. His rule, his intelligence, and his dedication to the arts elevated Florence during one of the most important eras in our history. ushering mankind out of the Dark Ages and into the light.
Since we've already talked a little about Lorenzo and Giuliano's appearances, let's get into the recreations. I've used these terracotta busts to bring the brothers to life. Lorenzo's bust is here on the left. It was said that 3 life-size wax models of Lorenzo were commissioned after the failed attempt on his life. They were even dressed in Lorenzo's own clothes, including the bandages he wore after the attack, to serve as a reminder of his survival. All of the depictions we have of Lorenzo today, including this bust, are not contemporary, but they're believed to have derived from these original waxworks. On the right, we have the terracotta bust of Giuliano, sculpted by Andrea del Verrocchio. So, let's take a look at the faces of Lorenzo and Giuliano de Medici now.